So back to the question of what is an Ember Day?
Okay, so it's an annual observance in the liturgical year. It happens 4 times a year, and they coincided with the ancient Roman harvest seasons. Okay, they are celebrated on Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays 4 times a year. So originally, the Ember Days had a festive character, coming from their original setting in pagan Roman times. Later, they were received a penitential character, but in that respect, this may seem as an oxymoron, but you've heard the phrase "we fast with joy." The other one, when our Lord Himself is telling us, when you fast, don't frown, don't go around without a smile, like the hypocrites do. People shouldn't know you're really fasting. And again, it's a sense of joy that we have this opportunity to give something back to God by doing something bodily to ourselves, just as Christ did for us in His passion, let alone the rest of His life.
Let me ask you, you mentioned the Roman festive origins of this, as many listeners have probably heard at some point in their life, especially if you lived here in the South, like I have. A lot of anti-Catholics will say, well, this is just another example of how the Roman Church is really just of pagan origin. Is this, in fact, a better example of the Church kind of co-opting pagan festivals?
Absolutely. We're going to discuss that point a little more in detail here in a moment.
Go ahead.
Before we get to that, what we really need to understand also is the relevance of the word ember. This is often confusing to people, and some people erroneously, unfortunately, tried to make some allusion to embers, burning embers or something like that. And it has nothing to do with that at all, actually. So the Latin title for the Ember Days is actually QUATUOR Tempora. QUATUOR Tempora, which just means the 4 seasons or 4 times of the year, or 4 parts of the year, because the liturgical year is divided into these 4 parts. The word ember is an English liturgical name. Now, in English, we have a lot of our own liturgical names that are different than what's in Latin. Christmas, Michaelmas, Candlemas. These are all examples. Christmas, Nativity of our Lord. Michaelmas, the Feast of St. Michael the Archangel. Candlemas, the Purification of Blessed Virgin Mary. Okay, so we have a lot of our own little terms that we use, and ember is one of these, and it's highly significant. So the word ember is a Middle English word or term. It comes from Ember Days, and I'll spell that for you. Ember is Y-M-B-E-R, and Days is D-A-Y-E-S. So if you go to Middle English, by the way, it's not pronounced like today. If you can go up on YouTube and find how Chaucer's Canterbury Tales was originally pronounced, which sounds more like German. It's really awesome, and they give you the modern English text next to the how Chaucer actually wrote it, and you can hear the great shift that we had. Now, that Middle English term, Ember Days, actually comes from an earlier Anglo-Saxon term, and I'm going to try to pronounce this correctly. Tolkien might come after me for this. He was an expert on this stuff, J.R. Tolkien. Ymbrendagas, which is plural for Ymbregdag, which means reoccurring day, or to break it down, Yimba is a circuit or rotation. Rinna is a running, and Dag is a day. So you can see how this means a calendar appointment for the Anglo-Saxons. And one thing I think we tend to forget, we have this tendency amongst us to think we are so smart today and we're so much more intellectual than our ancestors were. I mean, we've got space shuttles, we've got satellites, and we seem to forget that astronomy was a huge element in ancient cultures from not just in Europe, but also we see the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Chinese. The Chinese blew away, by the way, the medieval Europeans when it came to astronomical knowledge. I mean, the Mayans were absolutely incredible, and they did this with extremely primitive means, and yet they built these very accurate calendars and everything. By the way, for the Mayan calendar that supposedly meant the end of the world, my opinion in that is the reason the poor Mayan compiler simply got tired of compiling years, and he went off to have a beer. He just never came back. It's kind of like, if you were to look in the front of your altar missal or your daily missal, you have not only a table of movable feasts that give you several years in advance. Well,
Right.
If you go back to some of the older ones that are printed before Vatican II, they end in 1972. That
Right.
doesn't mean the end of the world's going to happen. No, they just didn't want to go any further.
Yeah.
I thought that was so laughable when everyone was like, "Oh, it's the end of the world. The Mayan calendar shows it." No, I think he just got tired. I would have gotten tired.
Sure.
After 1,000 years, I've been like, forget it. I'm done.
Yeah.
Okay. Any case, so this term Ember is from this Anglo-Saxon / Middle English word Yimber. Some people try to say it's a mutation or deformation of the word tempora, but that doesn't really quite actually make sense. When especially we know there's these words in Middle English and Anglo-Saxon, and we know what they actually mean. So, any case, so now to get to your question, Jeff, the history behind the Ember Days. When did they start? So there's a rather lengthy history. Now, some of this is shrouded in the midst of time, like so much early liturgical history.
What else do we need to know about the history of Ember Days that drives kind of the whole goal of this practice?
So pagan Rome had 3 seasonal celebrations they had to do with agriculture. The first one is called the Feriae Sementive. So Feriae is a weekday, okay? And this is the Feast of Sowing. Sementive means the seminal, okay? So this is taking place during the middle of November, between the middle of November and the winter solstice, okay? So there was some planting going on at this time. Remember, we're talking about Italy, other parts of the Roman Empire. The second one is the Feriae Mesis, which is the harvest festival. This would occur in June. And this is the harvest of grain. Really important to Rome is grain, okay? All right, so then we have the third one, the Feriae Vendimiales. And this is the Feast of Wine, Vendimiales, okay? And this is before the autumn equinox, so about September, okay? And this is the harvest of grapes. Now, by the way, the Roman calendar is quite different than what our calendar is today, okay? What we're used to. Now, these were festive celebrations that the Romans would do, and they included sacrifices to the pagan gods to obtain favor, and they survived for quite a long time. And so the popes sought to sanctify these pagan seasonal festivals as the Pope sought to baptize many things that were really only natural to mankind. Many of these things it's only natural that we would beseech God for his blessings, for what we plant in the ground and what we take out of the ground. He is, after all, the creator. He is providence, okay? And so really they just said, look, there's nothing wrong per se with having an observance for this. We just need to direct it correctly. It's the same thing with the holy sacrifice of the Mass, okay? Major pagan religions had a concept of sacrifice. Erroneously, from the Jewish one eventually was made null and void, but you had others that were human sacrifice, animal sacrifice, the concept of shedding blood to appease a greater deity was understood. It was just the wrong way. Okay.
Right.
So the popes sought to sanctify these pagan seasonal festivals. And by going a step further, the church actually added a fourth seasonal observance in March. Okay. Now, when was this March Ember Day added? The date is not certain, but certainly by the 5th century, we know that it existed because we have Pope Gelasius I. He was between 492 and 496. He mentions the fourth in one of his writings. So we know by the 4th century, we have a fourth Ember Day in addition to the other three. Now, there are 4 sets of Ember weeks in a liturgical year. Sometimes they're called Ember tides in English. Okay. And just like, by the way, when we have maybe an octave, we have Pentecost tide or Christmas tide, okay, or Easter tide, because there's an 8-day continual observance. All right. So we have Ember tides as well, which is, again, another cool English term that we give. Now, the 4 sets of Ember weeks is perhaps inspired by corresponding 4 seasons of the year. That would only be natural. We have, we have spring, summer, autumn, winter. Okay. But there's another possible reason, and that there, in the Jewish practice, there were 4 fasting periods, okay, of 4 times of the year that the Jews would really go about fasting. This is mentioned in Zechariah chapter 8, okay, where they talk about this Jewish practice of the fasting. And by the way, the Jewish weekly fasting, we'll see, also affects these Ember Days, okay? So there is some relation to the synagogue or the practice of religion under the Old Covenant. All right. So it's not absolutely sure what absolutely motivated these 4 times of Ember weeks. I would say it's probably eventually both. Okay. Now, each period of these Ember weeks were also extended to 3 days of the week: Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays. And this is quite significant. These were what was called the traditional stational days. Now, I don't have time to go into the ancient papal stational liturgy, but essentially, on appointed days of the year, they would end up at a stational church, which is one of the churches, one of the basilicas in Rome, whether it was a major basilica or a minor basilica. And there the Pope would offer, or his representative would offer, this Mass. And these stational churches had a lot of significance to them often as well for certain reasons, okay? But we don't have time to go into that today. It's a whole subject in itself. That being said, the stational liturgy plays an incredible, crucial part in the formation of our Roman liturgy that we have today. And it's worthwhile trying to learn something about that. And one of the easiest ways you can go is go to the Catholic Encyclopedia of 1913. It's online. You go to newadvent.org, literally New Advent, 2 words put together. And they have the 1913 Catholic Encyclopedia. Look up stational liturgy. You can probably Google it, and you'll find other sources too. There are a lot of terrific sources. There's a lot of information out there on these stational liturgies. All right. Now, the other thing about these stational liturgies, they were being held traditionally on Wednesdays, Fridays, Saturdays, and Sundays, and also other greater feast days, which might be some other day of the week. The Wednesday, Friday, Saturday is rather significant. The Jews traditionally fasted on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The church had some reluctance in imitating the Jews completely. This is why at first they were kind of reluctant even to use incense in the Mass. So they were using them in funerals like the pagan Romans and Jews did. Okay. There's a whole history behind that and how that enters into our own sacred liturgy, even the consecration of altars, which is quite cool. Even the use of candles, not only because of relation to Jews, but also to pagan Romans. And eventually this breaks down and say, you know, all these things are good things. We can use these things. But there's some reluctance to have some affiliation completely. Now that be said, they didn't copy a lot of things that the Jews did. They certainly did. We're going to see that in the Ember Day liturgies themselves. But the other thing that's focused as well is, remember now the Sabbath. The Jewish Sabbath is Saturday. And in fact, in Latin, that's preserved because the Latin term for Saturday is Sabbato. Okay. It's not Saturninus, okay, or something like that. Okay. It's Sabbato. But the apostles, to commemorate the resurrection of Jesus Christ, now changed the Sabbath to Sunday, the Lord's Day. So now this frees up another day. And so now they add Saturday as one of these traditional fast days as well in this respect. And they change it to Wednesday, Friday, Saturday. All right. By the way, if you're tertiary, you know that in your traditional rule that you're typically throughout the entire year, you're asked to fast and abstain every Wednesday, every Friday, every Saturday of the year. So like if you're a Benedictine oblate, if you're a Dominican tertiary, a Franciscan tertiary, a Carmelite tertiary, those older religious orders have that, which goes back to these old, instead of doing the Ember Days only, 4 times a year, they were doing them all year long as tertiaries. Okay. I'm sure it's related. Okay. Now, the other thing that happens with these Ember Days that are 4 times a year on the stational days. Stational days, again, were Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays usually. Fasting for them was optional. And what I mean is, I'm not talking about the communion fast. I'm talking about fasting, abstaining for penance. Okay. They were optional, but eventually the Ember Days became a obligatory fast and abstinence, as opposed to the other Wednesday, Friday, Saturday stational days. Again, it's not absolutely known. The point is, we know that by the 4th century, that the Ember Days already carry mandatory fasting. 4th century. This is how early this goes back. Okay. Now, regarding the institution of the Ember Days themselves, we know that Pope St. Leo the Great, who's 440 to 461 AD, he writes these wonderful sermons for the Ember Days specifically. And amongst these sermons, he believes that these Ember Days were actually instituted by the holy apostles themselves. There are others who may say this. We don't know. Okay. Now, that being said, we know that originally this is a Roman practice and remains a Latin Rite practice, exclusive Latin Rite practice. In fact, by the way, the Ember Days are not even observed in Milan, which is not that far from Rome, until the time of St. Charles Borromeo. Okay, so it takes a long time before they get diffused everywhere throughout the West. Okay, but they're not practiced in the East. Okay, just like the rogations, by the way. We know from Pope Gregory the 7th, he's 1073 to 1085, that he prescribed the dates of observance. So basically what he did, we set down when will the Ember Days be observed in the liturgical year, according to the calendar. Because before that, priests could actually choose when they were going to do it in their churches. Bishops could choose when they were going to do it in their dioceses. There wasn't a hard, fast rule yet. So it's finally, we get into the 11th century and we have Pope Gregory the 7th. And what he prescribes is that on Wednesday, Friday, and Saturday of the weeks after, so the first one is December 13th, after the feast of St. Lucy, important martyr in the Roman calendar. Ash Wednesday, which is a movable date. Pentecost Sunday, another movable date. And then after September 14th, the exaltation of the cross. So that's what they would use to figure out when will the Ember Days fall. Okay, so the week after those important dates. And in England, and what they did was they made two slight alterations to determining the Ember weeks of Advent and September. So for Advent, they now reckoned that it was the week that fell after the third Sunday of Advent. And for September, which is this week, that the Ember Days would fall on the week after the third Sunday of September. Now, there are two reasons why this is done. Now, for September especially, for the September Ember Days, this was done to fix an issue that was going on with the breviary readings and prayers, mainly the lessons from sacred scripture. And because it was affixed to the Holy Cross exaltation, it caused some issues where the priests weren't able to do the readings. So this fixed that situation, is what they did. So rather than attach it to what was considered a floating date, it's now more, okay, we now know it's going to be the third Sunday of September. Before, they used to have to figure out, was it the third calendar week of September, the third calendar Sunday of September, or the third liturgical Sunday of September? Because the first one could actually begin at the end of autumn. It was a crazy, it was more complicated than it really needed to be, okay? So this is why they do that. Another reason why I believe they did this is for both Advent and September is now the Ember Days are part of what's called the Temporal Cycle. The Temporal Cycle is a seasonal cycle of the church's liturgical calendar or year. So the Sundays, okay, the movable dates that are contingent on Easter, like the Ascension, Pentecost, okay, even Corpus Christi, okay, Feast of Christ the King, okay. These are all considered to be part of that temporal cycle. And the temporal cycle is directed first and foremost to God. We have below that the sanctoral cycle. This is the veneration or cult of the saints. And it's subservient to the temporal cycle for the most part. Now, in this respect, I think that using dates for the temporal cycle reinforced again, the Ember Days are an important part of the temporal cycle. And we're going to go into a little bit later how this is emphasized more by its liturgical rank, what they did also during this time frame of the 20th century. Okay. In any case, now, during the reign of Pope Gelasius I, again, the late 5th century, the Ember Days were only known at Rome. Okay, we know we have all four Ember weeks by this time. Now, in 494, we know that Pope Gelasius permitted ordinations of deacons and priests on Saturday. Okay, and this will become an important aspect of these Ember Days going forward. Okay, and this then gave greater importance to the prayer and fasting nature that came to typify the Ember weeks. So the next question we got to ask is, what's the goal of the Ember Days? And it's twofold. So first, to give thanks for natural and supernatural gifts of God, of his great providence, mainly through crops of different types, as we'll go in a little bit later. Okay, that was the first reason. That was why the Romans were doing this, the ancient pagan Romans. A second reason became attached, and that was for the sanctification of the church through the increase of her sacred ministers, of her clergy. So to pray for vocations and for the priests themselves who are going to work in the Lord's vineyard. Another connection to harvesting, to agriculture. And our Lord himself refers to this in his parables. We're talking about to go to work in the vineyard, those kind of things. All right. Now, there are some specific themes or harvesting themes that are given to Ember weeks, and they're forms of gratitude to God that we give through not only acts of fasting, prayers, but also through the sacred liturgy. So in spring, we have the sowing period, the sowing of the crops, the sowing of the seed. Okay. And this is to give gratitude or thanks for rebirth of nature, everything springing forth again after a very long winter, and the gift of light. Light. We see this in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but also remember the days are becoming longer again. They had been shorter in winter, darkness was tending to pervade, and now they're getting longer. Okay. Autumn, we have a grape harvest. Okay, especially another special important thing for Italians or Romans, okay, are the grapes. All right. And then winter, they talk about the harvest of olives, another important commodity, wheat, grapes, olives for Romans, okay? But there's another significant aspect to give thanks for in the middle of the winter. And that is to give gratitude for a successful preservation of the harvest. And sometimes we forget that aspect of the harvest is you not only got to go and get the harvest and bring it in, but you got to make sure it's safely secured against, rodents and pestilence and going moldy and whatever it's going to be. Okay. And so the fact that you've been able to successfully reserve it so it'll carry you through those winter months. Okay. So you're giving thanks for a successful, storage of this. Now, all of this, by the way, can connect with us spiritually, supernaturally, with the living grace in our own lives. And in fact, the church makes this connection. One, sowing, the planting of grace. First through baptism, then as we go throughout the liturgical year, intersacred liturgy, through the sacramentals, okay, through piety, okay. Summer, we have a wheat crop, okay. Autumn, we have a grape harvest. Winter, we have an olive harvest. So we're harvesting the fruits, the merits from the successfully employing these graces that have been planted in us. We've watered them, we put some sunshine on them, in various supernatural spiritual ways, through the sacraments of penance, of communion, of frequent prayer, all these things, the sacramentals, okay? And then we have these things stored up for us, so when we get to heaven, all of it's there waiting for us, and we get crowned with all those merits and graces that we've stored up over time. Now, in connection with ordinations, Ember Days have now been associated as a time of preparation for ordinations, not just, by the way, to the diaconate and the priesthood, but even the minor orders, okay, going on. But you may say also, the Ember Days, one thing I kind of like about them, they punctuate 4 times of the year. But so these 4 seasons are always on our minds. They're always on our minds. Well, the church now liturgically punctuates our calendar, lets the liturgy impress herself on our calendar that we have yearly without even thinking about it. And what I love about this, in a sense, the Ember Days are a type of pause or a moment of reflection, almost a mini spiritual exercise, you might say, if you're following those, because you get to just take a moment to reflect on God's goodness, his providence, and we get to realize how much we are dependent on God for everything. Moving on to the Ember Days and their sense of obligation. So were they obligatory once, and what about now? So they are, according to the traditional calendar, obligatory, okay, as part of the universal calendar of the Latin rites. Gradually, they became obligatory, okay? Obviously, they were being practiced in Rome, okay, and eventually they got spread throughout the entire Latin church. Now, okay, an interesting point, though, is before the 1960 Code of Rubrics, some Ember Days could be outclassed by the Temporal Cycle, okay? And one of the great things that the Pagan reform, or the 1960 Code of Rubrics, did is it restored the primacy of the Ember Days as part of the temporal cycle. So one of the things they were doing was trying to always make sure that for the most part, the temporal cycle always trumped. It always had the precedence because, okay, so what happened here was the Ember Days got raised to a third class rank, all of them. Now, some of them, for instance, the Ember Days of Advent and Lent had already been raised to the status prior because all the Lenten ferials had been raised to a third class rank status. Okay. But the other ones were still, they could still be outclassed by a third class feast of a saint. Okay. Well, it later became a third class feast of a saint. So this was done to ensure that not only that the temporal cycle was being done, promoted, especially when we see the significance of the Ember Days, but also to ensure that the penitential spirit that was now intended during this part of the year was being observed. So not a festivity per se. Okay. So the special liturgical significance of the Ember Days. The Ember Days preserve some very ancient features of the Roman Mass. The most notable one is the additional scriptural lesson. Another thing about some of these ancient features, I talked about stational churches. That's another example. Don't have time to go into all of it, but as an example, St. Peter's Basilica in Rome is one of those stational churches, and this is where ordinations would occur. And one of the traditions that had been held was that St. Peter himself did ordinations on Ember Saturday. So this is why it's down St. Peter's Basilica on one of them. Okay. We see also in the format of Ember Saturdays, it's a remnant of the ancient vigil that would be held on Sabbato, Saturday, all night long vigil until Sunday dawn, and then they would offer the holy sacrifice of the Mass. The Ember Days are the last, and the Ember Saturdays, I should say, Ember Saturdays from a formation standpoint are the last remnant of that. Now, some people believe, again, that practice of ordaining priests on an Ember Saturday goes back to the Holy Apostles. In this case, we're obviously referring to St. Peter because it's a Roman practice. We're not referring to like the other apostles spread throughout the rest of the world. All right. Apostles in this case would include St. Paul.
Thank you, Louis, for that deep dive into this fascinating topic. And you've covered so many other things. Folks, we've been talking with Louis Tofari today about the Ember Days. God bless and have a great day.
All right. Take care.